Kucharski, Senior Fellow by video conference, and from Soy Canada, Brian Innes, Executive Director. Now, we normally provide 5 minutes for opening statements, but we'll ask you to keep tight to time because there's quite a number of statements to be made, and we want to leave lots of time for questions. So, who would like to start? Shall we start with you, Mr. Harvey? 5 minutes or less?
Okay. Bonsoir et merci aux membres du comité.
Good evening and thank you to members of the committee for inviting me here today. The Canadian Agri-Food Trade Alliance is a coalition of national organisations that advocates for a freer and fairer international trading environment for the agriculture and agri-food sector.
Paragraphs for the time. CAFTA members have established the following priorities for our work. First, to open new markets for Canadian agri-food. This includes prioritizing trade liberalization discussions with growing emerging markets in the Indo-Pacific, like Indonesia and ASEAN countries. To uphold the international rules-based trading system. A delegation of CAFTA members attended the WTO's recent ministerial conference in Abu Dhabi. We witnessed firsthand the challenges the system is facing, and we support Canada's efforts through the Ottawa Group to advance key priorities at the WTO. To strengthen trade diplomacy capacity and industry-government collaboration. We welcome the opening of the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in Manila, and CAFTA is co-chairing the industry working group that is ensuring alignment between government and stakeholders. The Indo-Pacific region currently accounts for over 1/3 of the world's economic activity, and in 2023, Canada's agriculture and agri-food exports to the region reached $22.8 billion. In 2021, Canada was ranked the 7th largest agri-food and seafood supplier to China, with values of $11.7 billion, or 3.5% of market share. China's top agri-food and seaport imports from Canada were canola seeds, canola oil, and barley. China is our second largest market for agri-food exports. CAFTA strongly supported the opening of the Manila office because we believe Canadian business will benefit from more sustained Canadian engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Culturally, it is essential to have Canadian representatives on the ground to develop personal relationships. CAFTA members travel regularly to the region and have seen the need to have permanent representation on the ground. It is essential that the office have the technical expertise needed to manage relationships with local authorities to help prevent the emergence of non-tariff barriers that can keep Canadian product out of market. It's also important to note that our agri-food competitors are also very present in the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. and Australia are particularly engaged, have strong infrastructure on the ground, and have developed solid relationships with local buyers. I wish to underline to committee members that exporting food responds not just to Canada's economic interest, but also to our national security interest of making an important contribution to international peace and security. Canada is the world's 5th largest agri-food exporter. We're one of the few countries in the world producing enough food for ourselves while at the same time feeding others around the world. We contribute to international peace and stability by feeding the hungry, especially at a time of international instability when major grain producers are at war. Canada also has a strong track record of not using food as a political weapon or banning agricultural exports. That helps make us a more reliable supplier to countries seeking greater food security. En résumé, il est dans l'intérêt économique.
In summary, it is in Canada's economic and national interest to increase our agri-food exports to the Indo-Pacific region. This requires consistent, long-term investment in commercial relations with buyers and national authorities. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harvey. Now we'll go to Mr. Carey from the Canadian Canola Growers Association.
Thank you for the invitation to appear before this special committee. The Canadian Canola Growers, or CCGA, is the national association for Canada's 43,000 canola farmers, representing them on issues, policies, and programs that impact their farm success. Developed in Canada, canola is a staple of Canadian agriculture as well as science and innovation. Canola is a strong economic contributor to family farms and rural communities. Canola is the number one revenue source of farmers, earning Canadian farmers $13.7 billion in 2023. Canadian canola exports were valued at $15.8 billion in 2023, with 90% of this crop exported as seed, oil, or meal. Annually, the canola sector contributes $29.9 billion to the Canadian economy and provides for 200,000 jobs. The Indo-Pacific region is a critical area for growth and development for the export of Canadian canola, seed, oil, and meal. Of greatest importance in the region for canola is China. Canada exports canola seed, oil, and meal to China, making it the second most important market for Canadian canola farmers. The main exports in recent years are seed and canola meal. In 2023, Canada exported nearly 4.6 million metric tons of canola seed to China, the second highest export to date, making it the most important seed market. Canola meal exports to China are becoming increasingly important, with 1.8 million metric tons exported in 2023, for a total value of canola exports to China in 2023 of $5 billion. The canola industry is set to grow, both in terms of total canola yield as well as the volume of canola that is processed in Canada into oil and meal. Increased canola processing in Canada could generate potential 3 million metric tons of additional canola meal. While canola oil is seeing high demand as a feedstock of renewable fuel production in North America, the additional canola meal volume produced will need to continue to find high-value markets. China's high demand for protein ingredients, as well as plans to diversify its vegetable protein sources for livestock feed, position canola meal well within the market. In addition, China's growing dairy industry and canola meal is a proven ingredient to support increased milk production. In addition to China, the Indo-Pacific region holds opportunity for canola products to be valued and in high demand. Countries of interest for Canadian canola farmers within the region include Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, Pakistan, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. Japan is a consistent and loyal buyer of Canadian canola, with strong ties between our two countries that support reliable trade. Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and Philippines all represent markets of interest for canola meal. These countries have growing feed markets and increasing demand for vegetable protein ingredients. South Korea has also been a consistent importer of canola oil over the past decade. Canadian canola farmers grow a high-value crop that is in demand around the globe. Within the Indo-Pacific region, China remains a critical market for importance to farmers, with the industry committed to fostering and expanding this trading relationship. In addition, we see value in the work the Canadian government and our fellow associations are doing to expand market opportunities within the Indo-Pacific region that are aligned with the growth of our industry. The newly opened first-of-its-kind Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office in Manila will play a key role in market access, reducing trade disruptions, and likely assist in ongoing free trade agreement negotiations with ASEAN and Indonesia. Look forward to your questions, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carey. Now we'll turn to Brian Innes from Soy Canada for 5 minutes or less.
Merci, Mr. President. I'm here representing Canada's soybean industry. So that includes Canadian seed developers, that includes our farmers, that includes our processors and our exporters. We have a very diverse industry that spans the production from Atlantic Canada all the way to the Rocky Mountains. Soybeans are the third most valuable crop here in Canada, with exports worth about $3.5 billion per year. We produce world-leading food-grade soybeans to make things like tofu and soy milk, but also commodity soybeans to make meal to feed livestock and oil for humans and biofuel. With more than 70% of our production exported every year, we're very, very focused on global markets. And before I describe why the Indo-Pacific strategy is important for us, I'd like to share why the region itself presents an opportunity. From a soybean perspective, the Indo-Pacific is the heartbeat of global demand. Take the ASEAN region, for example, which excludes other important markets like Japan, China, and Korea. ASEAN imports approximately $9 billion worth of soybeans every year, and our Canadian exports are about $470 million into this region. We see a lot of opportunity for growth. So, for example, the USDA sees demand for soybeans in ASEAN to grow by 25% now through 2028. And with the committee's focus on China, it's also important to recognize that China is the world's biggest importer of soybeans, demanding 60% of all the soybeans traded in the world. It's also a very important market for Canadian soybean producers and industry. So the question facing us today is how the Indo-Pacific strategy can help us seize these opportunities in the Indo-Pacific. For our sector, this will happen by helping to improve access to these markets. First, we need to eliminate tariffs and establish mechanisms of regulatory cooperation through the Canada-Indonesia free trade negotiations. Eliminating tariffs would create growth opportunities and predictability. So, for example, right now, Indonesia could raise their tariffs on soybeans to 27%. But eliminating tariffs is not enough. We also need to address non-tariff barriers like sanitary and phytosanitary issues. Things that can suddenly appear, can create costs, and can even stop trade. Second, we need to continue engaging all countries in the region around our shared interest in stable food trade. As my colleague Michael shared, Canada is one of the few countries that can produce food for itself as well as others. Our agri-food sector is an engine of growth, and for our customers in the Indo-Pacific, they depend on what we produce to feed their people and their animals. And what we come to produce comes from what we invest. And what we invest is highly influenced by predictability. So it's in everyone's interest to support rules-based trade and to continue engagement that supports stable food trade. Lastly, we need to make the most of the newly established Indo-Pacific Agri-Food Office under the strategy to work proactively to prevent trade issues and also to address them quickly when they arise. We welcome the office as an important tool to prevent and resolve trade issues. And the exciting part is we're already seeing it work. We're already seeing that engagement help bring more collaboration and cooperation between governments. One way we're seeing this is by regulators connecting with their counterparts. They're connecting to discuss plant health issues so that they can better understand how governments can regulate these things to prevent trade risk, connecting to improve understanding so that small regulatory differences on how weed seeds are regulated don't create trade barriers. So as we look to the future, we see the office as a really helpful tool that can help with new technologies too, like seed technologies such as gene editing. So throughout the region, regulations are evolving, though often not in sync with what's happening here in Canada. So investing in more collaboration between Canadian and Indo-Pacific regulators can really help minimize differences that can create trade barriers or regulations that are not based on sciences. Je vous remercie de m'avoir permis.
I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy and how it can help us to seize growth opportunities in the region of the Indo-Pacific, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. We'll now turn to Mr. Kucharski from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for 5 minutes or less, sir.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to address your committee today. I would like to make a few remarks on Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy by first talking about the external environment which we now face, and then make some observations about the strategy itself. First of all, in my view, the IPS is probably the most significant, comprehensive, and ambitious strategic document on the Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific region that the Canadian government has ever issued. It comes at a time when the rules-based international order is being increasingly challenged by China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes. Consequently, the link between economic security and national security has become increasingly critical to Western nations, including Canada. Canada has a huge stake in maintaining peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. In 2022, Canada's total trade with the region was $270 billion, or about 18% of Canada's total global trade. Much of this trade goes by maritime vessel through contentious waters, South and East China Seas, so any disruptions in that area could have devastating consequences for Canada and indeed the global economy. As we all know, China is a significant trading partner of Canada and at the same time a rival and a security threat to Canada and our allies. Yet the Indo-Pacific strategy will not live or die based solely on Canada's relations with China. Canada's trade with China represented only about 8.5% of Canada's total trade in 2022, but the balance of trade is heavily in China's favor. Their exports to Canada, over $100 billion, are more than 3 times what they import from Canada. Given the realities we face with a rising China, it's in Canada's interest to be more pragmatic and transactional with China, while prioritizing and broadening our economic and security relations with allies like Japan and South Korea, as well as pursuing deeper economic ties with ASEAN nations and Taiwan. While the IPS itself is quite comprehensive, it does have a few gaps and shortcomings in my view. One issue is that it appears to be where there's a gap is between Canada's commitment to multilateralism and the realities Canada is faced with in the world. A host of minilateral groupings have sprung up in the Indo-Pacific to address urgent and/or unique regional economic and security issues. While Canada is a member of the CPTPP, it has been left out of other fora, such as the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and security partnerships such as the Australia, UK, US, or AUKUS partnership. A strategy to address Canada's participation in these and other minilaterals is not addressed in the IPS. Also, while the strategy acknowledges that the North Pacific faces growing security challenges, there's no reference at all to Russia in the strategy. Russia is also an Indo-Pacific nation and a regional security concern and poses threats to Canada in the longer term, especially in the Arctic. With regard to trade, the Indo-Pacific strategy notably aims to position Canada as a responsible and reliable energy security partner, but makes no mention of Canada's hydrocarbon resources, even though Canada is an environmentally responsible, world-scale producer. In fact, the first tanker carrying the Trans Mountain Pipeline's first shipment of crude oil to Asia left Burnaby just last Wednesday. Next year should see LNG Canada's project come online. Canada will then be in a position to help the region lower its coal emissions. The IPS emphasizes clean energy, which is fine, but hydrocarbons are in demand in the region now and likely will be for decades. All of Canada's energy resources should play a part in leveraging Canada's position in the region, so in my view, this is a significant oversight. Ultimately, the effectiveness and success of the IPS will depend on two things. The first is how the U.S. views our commitment to the region, which is to say, are we prioritizing national security and defense as well as trade and economics? U.S. concerns with Canada's failure to meet our NATO commitments have been made all too clear in the past few days on this issue. Meeting our defense commitments at a time when threats are growing is essential to being taken seriously when it comes to being seen as a partner in the region and being invited to join regional fora. The second key factor is Canada's ability to achieve the goals in the IPS. Much will depend on the strength of Canada's economy and the ability to actually execute on the strategy. Unfortunately, Canada's share of global exports is falling, manufactured exports are stagnating, and our GDP is underperforming our peers. Canada also needs to urgently address the inadequacies and supports for Canada's foreign service and the personnel, readiness, and funding issues plaguing the military. Thus, there are real concerns about Canada's capacity to deliver over the longer term. I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm critical or pessimistic. In fact, quite the opposite. My main concern is with follow-through and ensuring the strategy is properly resourced and effectively implemented, as I believe its success is an essential component for Canada's long-term prosperity and security. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. Kacharski. We'll now go to our first round of questioning, which will be first Mr. Couric, then Mr. Oliphant. Mr. Perron is going to be joining us, and Mr. Bergeron will be ceding his time to him. And, of course, Ms. McPherson will round up our first round of questioning. So, Mr. Couric, the first to you for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I think it's self-evident that Canada needs trade and that we should be, and I would suggest can be, the supplier of choice. And in particular, I look at the three gentlemen here when it comes to our agricultural sector. And yet, it seems to be that when it comes to our place, we don't seem to be growing as fast as certainly we could be. And I would suggest, and I would ask the question, the reason why I ask this question is because it's important when this committee compiles a report. So my question to the three gentlemen here at the end of the table is the method to which we transport our goods primarily to Asia would be what? If I could just go down the table, starting with Mr. Harvey, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Hines.
I mean, after leaving Canada by ship?
Mr. Carey?
Rail to port.
Mr. Hines?
And for soybeans, we're transporting in containers as well as transporting in bulk. We use a lot of containers, approximately 40,000 every year to export our soybeans.
And those would primarily go through?
Port of Montreal, Port of Halifax, Port of Prince Rupert, and Port of Vancouver.
Okay. So when it comes to the specifically the Indo-Pacific, we have one major port, and although I know that there's a lot of conversations that, in fact, that I've had with some of your organizations about expanding that, but I'm looking at a copy the World Bank had S&P do a report on port efficiencies. And I know my Liberal colleagues like to talk about S&P a lot, so I hope they'll note this in particular. And in the context of this report, the Port of Vancouver ranks, you can see it highlighted there, 347 out of 348 when it comes to port efficiency. So to the witnesses here at the end of the table, is that concerning in terms of Canada's potential when we are ranked so low when it comes to efficiencies of such a critical part of Canada's transportation infrastructure, which is essential to making sure that your members, those involved with your organizations, and the many producers that you all represent are able to get their products to market? We'll start with Mr. Harvey, and we'll keep it fairly short. But
working more on ports on a daily basis than me.
Okay, Mr. Carey.
Absolutely. I think Canada needs to get back in the business of nation building. We see if capacity is needed in the United States at Long Beach, they move heaven and earth regardless of party in power at the time. 7 out of 10 tons of grains grown in the prairies by farmers and many of your constituents, it goes through the Port of Vancouver still. We have one bridge that gets in the Port of Vancouver. We have one tunnel. And I know discussions with the city of Burnaby are 5 years now into improving some of the basic grade issues around railway passing. So it is a concern that is our gateway to the economic prosperity in Asia.
And I appreciate that. And move heaven and earth, I think, is a key phrase there, because you're absolutely right. We need to be a country that builds and actually gets things done. And it's regrettable that over the last 9 years or so that has not been the case. And just a shout out to my father, who's actually on the tractor right now. He said he's got a little over 1,000 acres of canola left to seed before we move to oats. So, Mr. Irons, you wanted to answer that.
Yes, thank you. So we export our soybeans in containers in bulk shipments. And to build on what my colleague said, predictability and reliability and cost competitiveness for Canadian shippers is paramount to our competitiveness. So in the soybean industry, we compete head-to-head with our American counterparts. And so when they have better service, when they have better rates, all of which comes from infrastructure as well as thinking about competition of the 3 global alliances that control the container market, for example. These are actions taken by government that have real impact on the shippers and our competitiveness that allows us to bring value here to Canada.
So when it comes to competitiveness, I'm glad you brought that up, because Canada, of course, pays a carbon tax, and while so that has an in particular and disproportionate effect on the transportation sector, specifically rail, which you all mentioned that it's important for commodities to get from the farm, which is generally by truck, to a inland port, which would then go on rail to a major port, and then from the port to wherever in the world. The carbon tax. Does that have an impact on Canada's competitiveness to be able to get our products to market? I'll start with Mr. Irons, then Mr. Carey, and then Mr. Harvey. Go ahead.
I think Mr. Carey is best placed to speak to this.
Sure, Mr. Carey.
It does. My organization has been a proponent of Bill C-234 since its inception. That would alleviate the carbon pricing on a farm. However, every time the price of carbon goes up, whether that's rail, whether that's inputs, custom haul trucking, that all gets passed down to the farmer in many ways. So farmers are saying that their major, for canola, we have 60% of the world trade is Canada, but Australia is our largest competitor. They're much closer to markets, and they do not have a carbon tax. So anything that takes money out of the farmers' pockets to reinvest in their operations does impact our ability to compete with places like the United States, Australia, and South America.
No, and I appreciate that, and I hope my Liberal colleagues are watching, because quite often they say, oh, well, because you get money back, therefore everything's a wash, but it's that impact that it has on competitiveness that is very significant. And 234 does address, at least in its original form, a key part of that. But you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that it's so much more than that in terms of the impact on the sector as a whole. Am I correct in that?
Yes, 234 is only for on-farm activities related to natural gas and propane use. However, all the costs that we all see as normal Canadians, as well as transportation.
And sorry to interrupt, just in my last 10 seconds, all of you, if you could quick answer, can Canada grow its place in the world when it comes to agricultural exports? Yes or no? Mr. Irons, Mr. Carey, and Mr. Harvey.
Absolutely.
100%. Yes.
Thank you.
Right on time, Mr. Currig. Well done, sir. All right, we'll go to Mr. Oliphant for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all the guests for being witnesses today with us. I'm not a trade person and I'm not a farmer. I eat food, so I care about what you do, but I really am going to ask some questions that may sound dumb. I want to talk about where Mr. Kirk ended up around growing the markets. And given the numbers you're talking about in terms of the billions of dollars of exports we are now doing in agri-food business, we're talking canola, soy, and others, how does that market grow? Is that growing because we're better than our competitors? Or is the market itself growing and we want a greater share of a new market? I just don't, I'm kind of interested in that to know. And then secondly, who are our competitors? You've mentioned the United States, you mentioned Australia in different ways, but so first of all, the growth of the market, does it come from expanded consumption or does it come from stealing or getting or earning a larger share of the markets that we're talking about? And then secondly, who are our competitors and how does the IPS perhaps help us to strategically position ourselves vis-a-vis either growing market or competitors? And why don't we start with soy? And then we can go to canola, then generally agri-food.
Yeah, thanks for the question. When we look at the Indo-Pacific especially, they're a region that needs protein and a region that needs oil. So the demand growth that we're seeing in soy for the two products that come from soy, oil and protein, are really coming because we're seeing population growth, we're seeing income growth, and we're seeing shifting diets that are really growing the market for plant-based proteins, for example. So growing more demand for soy milk, growing more demand for soy products, whether it's tofu or tempeh in Indonesia, for example. So when we look at that growth opportunity, it's all the above. It's more people, more income, changing diets. When we look at the competition we face, in food-grade soybeans, for example, Canada is a major player. The other major player in the world is the U.S. So we're about a third of the market, and the U.S. is most of the rest. So when we see competition, it really comes down to how we're able to produce a value-added product that provides the most value to our customer and the ecosystem that supports our ability to do that, as well as being competitive in the real things that we do, whether that's planting, moving, processing, and exporting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'd echo my colleague's comments, and perhaps I'll save the competitor side for my colleague Michael Harvey. It's a good question because despite rising export numbers, those are not bankable and not necessarily repeatable every year. We're dealing right now with global conflicts, which are leading to increased commodity prices. So in 2023, actually, we had a smaller canola crop because of droughts in Saskatchewan and other situations. So we have an opportunity to grow. As my colleague Brian said, there's a growing middle class, growing incomes that demanding different products. However, banking on the fact that we export almost $98 billion of agriculture products next year does not mean that we can necessarily repeat that year after year. If we're not reliable in our delivery of our products to global markets, other markets will go elsewhere. So we're in a good place, but we can't rest on our laurels.
Yeah, I'd say the main reason why the market is increasing is because the number of people on the planet is increasing, and then because the number of people in the planet who are eating better, who have moved into the middle class, are moving into the middle class, are moving up the chain, is increasing. So, as was mentioned, a lot more protein, but more calories in general, and higher quality calories. In terms of competitors, we already talked about the U.S., Australia. I'd also mention countries like Brazil and Argentina. I mean, the big agri-food exporters are countries that have a lot of land and have a lot of water. South America produces a lot of products that compete with ours globally.
Excellent. Mr. Carey, you mentioned drought last year. I know that there are droughts and periods that are up and down. Can you explain to me the impact of climate change and what is happening about climate change and how farmers are having to deal with this? And this could be in canola, it could be in soy, or more generally in agri-food. I am feeling it. I'm just wondering how farmers are dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, farmers at the forefront whenever there's significant changes. We had significant droughts in the prairies, particularly Saskatchewan last year, where our canola production was down to 18.3 million tons. If it wasn't for advances, as my colleague Brian alluded to earlier, in seed technology, some of those farmers would have been relying solely on crop insurance. But because of advances in research and development, increases in drought tolerance with crops like canola, soybeans, corn, etc., they were able to get off a decent-sized crop. For canola, it's moisture, nitrogen, and then not too much heat. So there's certainly going to be challenges. However, gene editing, now that the government has provided clarity on that pathway to commercialization, is a real opportunity for Canada to take back some of those global R&D dollars to invest in crops that need less water, can deal with greater heat, and can be grown in different soil zones.
I would just maybe echo Mr. Kurek, who was hoping Liberals were listening when he was talking about taxes, that Conservatives are listening when we're talking about climate change. I think it's a really important point. Mr. Innes, do you have anything you want to add?
Just to say that when we look into the future for the soybean industry, it has to work for farmers. And so as the climate evolves, so too do the crops that make sense for farmers in the regions that we farm. We're growing soybeans in the most northern places that they grow anywhere on the planet. And we have many diverse growing regions. And so when we think about innovation that needs to respond to farmers' needs, it's creating the varieties that work in the specific regions where farmers grow and that are resilient to changes in weather and are ultimately profitable for farmers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Innes. Thank you for your time, Mr. Oliphant. We'll now go to Mr. Perron for 6 minutes or less.
Oui, merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to the witnesses for being with us today in person or online. It's always a pleasure to see you. I'll start with Dave, Mr. Kerry, in fact. This particular committee studies the relationship with the People's Republic of China. In 2019, they blocked 2 Canadian companies from doing business with them. I'd like you to give us a rundown of what the impacts of that prohibition were, and given that the prohibition was lifted in 2022, how did the market recover? Did you take back the market shares that you previously had? Was the quantity of canola sold to China, did it drop over that period, in fact?
And so restrictions on Canada's 2 largest exporters of canola seed began in March 6, 2019. In 2018, we exported $2.8 billion worth of canola. After the restrictions, we were exporting $800 million, so a $2 billion loss in exports over a 1-year period. It is estimated that the economic impact to Canada was between $1.54 and $2.35 billion in 2021 as a result of that economic loss. But since market access has been reestablished for the 2 largest exporters, this year was actually our largest year ever of exporting canola seed. 2023 was exporting canola seed to China. As Brian said, China imports approximately 60% of the world's oil seed. So there's no getting away from their buying capacity, as well as their domestic crushing capacity. They have the ability to crush a lot of oil seed. So we have recovered. However, farmers certainly felt the acute economic impacts of losing our 2nd largest market.
Monsieur Innes, oui?
Et si je peux ajouter du côté du...
Well, as far as soybeans is concerned, and certainly in the case of Quebec producers, we've observed that our soybean exports to China have slowed down. 2018 was a major exportation year for both Western and Eastern Canada. However, in 2020, for example, we didn't export much whatsoever, and there was no formal mechanism, as in the case of canola, and our industry was highly affected by problems in our relationship with China, as well as the relationship between China and the United States. So we live in a multipolar world, and the same applies to soybeans as other commodities. We were affected by the trade war between the US and Canada, and also Canada vis-a-vis China. Well, thank you very much for that information. On that point, I was going to turn to you. China intends to increase its production of soya to reduce its reliance on other countries. They set an objective of an increased production, which is quite significant. Is that concerning, that development? Well, in the soybean world, we're a producer of top quality soy, both in Quebec, Manitoba, and Ontario. We produce top caliber soya in terms of its food grade. Now, what that means is the soya that we produce to make tofu and soy milk. Now, the soy from China isn't of the same quality. So that does have an impact, for example, on non-GMO production, but not on high-quality food-grade soya. Now, we've observed in Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines, our export markets, that yes, China is now a competitor, but not a significant competitor in the region. Thank you very much. So you think that you're still nevertheless going to do quite well at the end of the day, I see. Now, I'll just open the question up. We are going to continue to do trade with China. I think we're unanimous around the table on that issue, but we have to be pragmatic in doing so. How do we reduce our reliance on China pragmatically? Our exports to Asia Pacific, to what degree are they reliant on China? Can we further diversify markets? Is that the underlying objective of the Indo-Pacific strategy? And what about the Philippines? Do you place a lot of hope in this Indo-Pacific strategy? Do you intend to continue to diversify or largely focus on the Chinese market? Well, if I could chime in first, China is very important. And as our exporters say, when China sells, we buy. But based on our experience of the recent past, diversification remains crucial for the sector, and that is precisely why the Indo-Pacific strategy is so important to us, as well as the Agri-Foods and Agriculture Office in the Philippines, so that we can work on the issues that I outlined a moment ago. For example, the removal of non-tariff trade barriers. That's part and parcel of our strategy, so that we can have new trade agreements, A, and B, a strategy to work on those non-tariff barriers, as I mentioned. Yes, Dave.
It's critical. It is important. However, for canola in the region, there's really no getting around China. Will continue to be a major market. Agriculture products always flow to the countries that demand them. We certainly have been working on diversification. The United Arab Emirates has become a major market for us, just shy of $200 billion last year. But just to put it in context, $5 billion of canola exports to China in 2023, in a country like Vietnam, $604,000. So while there's certainly opportunity to, particularly with canola meal, which is the byproduct when you crush canola, you get oil and the meal certainly is something that we need to find new markets for. We've got more crush capacity in Canada, but 11 million metric tons now. We're adding about another 3 million tons. So there'll be new markets for meal, but China for the foreseeable future will be a hugely important market to Canada's canola farmers.
Thank you, Monsieur Perron. That's your time. We'll now go to Ms. McPherson for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this has been very interesting testimony. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us today. I have a few questions. I want to follow up on what Monsieur Perron was speaking about. And the whole point of the Indo-Pacific strategy is, of course, to ensure that we are reducing our reliance on China. So I understand what you're saying when you say, Mr. Kerry, that we have a very big reliance on China, and then that's not going to change in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, we saw the punitive non-tariff trade barriers that were put in place by China on the soy industry, on the canola industry, and we were also know that it was politically motivated. So there is that vulnerability in terms of our relationship with China that we have to manage. How do we manage that vulnerability? How do we deal with that? But also, as we develop relationships with other countries in the Indo-Pacific region, how do we ensure that those relationships are not as vulnerable to punitive actions that we've seen with historically with our relationship with China? Maybe I'll start with you, Mr. Kerry, and then I can go to Mr. Harvey and Mr. Hines.
Yeah, well, we're large proponents of the Indo-Pacific strategy and the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office. That part of the world is not transactional when they do business. They are built on long-term relationships. Western Europe, North America, even parts of Central America are transactional. When you get in the Indo-Pacific, these are about long-term relationships. So for us to do that, we've now established this office. We have a 5-year funding commitment from the federal government. 5 years is not long enough to build deep, meaningful relationships. So if we truly want to expand and diversify our markets, we need Canadian experts, we need Canadian industry, Canadian parliamentarians in market, not once a year, multiple times a year, to continue to build those relationships, as they are not transactional. They are deep and built on long-term relationships.
Mr. Harvey?
Sure. I'd say the way I see it is that, I mean, China is a market that's too large to replace exactly. And we're not the only ones dealing with this issue. If you look, our agri-food competitors, who are also our national security allies, like the United States and Australia, are dealing with similar issues. There's a political risk to manage, and that's not always easy to manage, and there's different ways to manage it, and one of the most important ways to manage it is to work on diversification of the markets, and that's where we've seen the Indo-Pacific office playing an important role.
And Mr. Ines?
Great, thank you. And just to elaborate on our experience in the soybean industry, having been exporting to Asia now for almost 4 or 5 decades, what we really see is the importance, to build on Dave's comments about relationships. As an example, our industry travels to the region together at least once a year. Our industry members themselves go more than that and have offices often. And where we were this year was in Thailand, and last year it was in Malaysia and Vietnam. And to tell you an example of how we can help this diversification, what we did while we were in Vietnam was meet with the local industry. We had a round table, something like this here today, with dozens of our customers, and we talked about the importance of stability of the relationship and how it was important working with our governments to work on trade issues together. And now with the office there, that enables more continuity so that the Government of Canada can be more present there more often. And so they're seen as a trusted partner, someone who is there working at multiple levels on the stable trade relationship. So for our industry, diversification means investing in relationships. It means supporting the investment of the Government of Canada in the Indo-Pacific office to help work through issues and build relations over time.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing to think about, because I think that there is a role for parliamentarians too to build those relationships and to ensure that we have that those connections and those relationships with people in the Indo-Pacific strategy as we try to diversify Canada's economy. But unfortunately, at this point, there is one party in the House of Commons that is not allowing for parliamentary travel at the moment, and it is disappointing, because I think there is that role there. I feel, Mr. Kuchowski, I feel like you're being a little bit abandoned, but we're both online. So I'm going to ask the next question of you, if I could. You spoke a lot about Canada being left out of the, as you call it, the mini-laterals, that we're not at those tables. We know that in the Indo-Pacific strategy that there is a desire by Canada to join in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity that the United States has launched in 2022. Can you explain why, first of all, why you think we're not being included? I think you touched on it, but just a little bit more detail. And also, do you think it is worthwhile? And what is the value of being part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, although it's certainly not as valuable to Canada as, say, the CPTPP is, which is a full-blown trade agreement, it is important to be at the table where significant players in the region are sitting down talking to each other. And unfortunately, we are not at that table. So it's not just about trade, or it's not even just about investment. It's about relationship building in the region. And we have not been able to establish our bona fides, as it were, yet in the region, because quite frankly, we've had decades of neglect. We've underinvested in the region. We have not come to the table as we should with the commitment that is expected of us on defense and security. And so as a result, I believe that that has made some countries reticent about inviting Canada to the table, and they're not sure if we're a serious player. And so that was what I was touching on in my earlier comments. So I think, as we go forward and as we do follow through on the commitments we've made in the Indo-Pacific strategy, and hopefully strengthen the ones that, on our military security side as well, that will change. But I think that's the background.
Thank you, Ms. McPherson. That's your time. We'll now go to our second round, and that will be Mr. Majumdar, Ms. Lalonde, Mr. Perron, and Ms. McPherson again. So, Mr. Majumdar, 5 minutes for you, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to see you, Jeff Koczarski. It's been a while. And I don't mean to be incestuous by bringing our Macdonald-Laurier roots together around this table, but I'll take advantage of the opportunity nevertheless. You've written extensively about the Indo-Pacific region. You've obviously looked at the Indo-Pacific strategy in careful detail. Let me ask you this. How is there a definition in the Indo-Pacific strategy of what the government terms as quote-unquote clean energy?
No, there isn't. It's a very general term, and it's defined, I guess, as they see it internally. So I couldn't tell you what clean energy is completely. Certainly, there are things that most of us would consider as clean energy, non-emitting types of energy, but people will differ on a definition of clean energy.
I appreciate that. We've seen, Professor Koczarski, that Europe has had a chance to redefine how it considers clean energy in the wake of Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine, particularly on things like LNG and nuclear. Would you agree, you've written extensively on Europe as well, but would you agree that that should be an international standard for, or at least the beginning of an international standard for defining what clean energy is?
Well, I do agree that if we're going to use a term like clean energy, it needs to be more specifically defined. And I think it should be more inclusive of even hydrocarbons where they are produced responsibly, where measures are taken to reduce emissions, because we're going to have to rely on all forms of energy in order to reach our emissions goals over time. So, yes, I would agree.
Well, thank you for that. You cautioned a little bit about what the impact of tension in the South China Sea could be, or even more widely in the waters of the Indo-Pacific region. Hong Kong Watch had recently published a report indicating that war with Taiwan would result in an 8% GDP hit to Canada, which is bigger than the COVID-19 pandemic, bigger than the global financial crisis. That would be 1% financial shocks, 5% semiconductor imports, 2% trade shocks. It strikes me that providing stability to the Indo-Pacific region, where you have energy suppliers like Russia leveraging their energy, or China's control and dominance of energy transition technologies, critical minerals, refinery, all that stuff, Canada could play a critical role in offsetting dependence on dictator energy. How important do you think our energy proposition means to the Indo-Pacific region, and therefore ought to be read into the Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, it's absolutely essential in my view, and I think the region will be significantly held back if Canadian energy exports are in any way inhibited to the region. The fact remains that natural gas, in particular LNG, is going to be required in the region to reduce the amount of coal being burned, and therefore to reduce emissions. So LNG as a substitute for coal is very important in their transition policies. A lot of these countries, particularly in ASEAN, are developing countries, and they are not able, or there are geographic reasons why renewables can't be installed immediately. So we're talking about transition that will take place over decades. And so that's going to require a wide range of energy sources. And Canada is in a position to provide responsible energy supplies to these countries as they transition going forward. And so it's a benefit to Canada, it's a benefit to them. They're asking us for these products, and we're just on the cusp of supplying for the first time. But I think more needs to be done.
Our national security, I guess, really serves international energy security. And I'm very grateful for your many interventions over many years in pushing Canada to think big about what it can be. Thank you very much. I'll close my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bajundar. And we'll go to Ms. Lalonde for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all our witnesses this evening. My first question would be for our representative from the Soy Canada industry. In early of February of 2024, Soy Canada led a mission to the Indo-Pacific region, what they describe as connecting with more than 150 current and potential customers in Japan and in Thailand. Maybe you can share with our committee the key opportunity for Canadian soybean producers to the region, but also what was the main outcome of the Soy Canada mission to the Indo-Pacific region, please?
Thank you. Merci pour la question. When we look at the region, there's just an immense opportunity for growth. More than 2/3 of our exports of soybeans from Canada go to the region. They're a region that loves soybeans. They love to eat soybeans, and they're a region that needs protein and needs oil. So specifically, when we look at Japan, one of our most valuable markets, they really value the quality that Canada provides. The soybeans that we can export there are of the highest quality, with over 100 different specific varieties going to specific tofu manufacturers, for example. I can give you a story. When we were in Japan, we were visiting a tofu factory in the mountains and got to try their deep-fried tofu. It's not something we would find here, but certainly in Japan, when we take our farmers, we take our exporters, we connect with our customers in a way that's just not possible virtually. When we were in Thailand, we were able to visit a soy milk manufacturing facility, an ultra-modern facility that was a little bit different than tofu in the sense that they're looking for a more generic soybean. But what they value from Canada is the reliability of what we're able to produce, and also as a trusted partner to deliver when they expect it to be delivered. So when we look at the opportunities and what we take from that, in connecting our farmers, we had farmers from Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba and Saskatchewan with us on the mission to see directly where their soybeans go and to see that container of soybeans opened at the soy milk manufacturer and dump into their facility was a real gratifying moment for our farmers to see not only how they plant and ship their soybeans, but also where they're used halfway, in fact, all the way around the world. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the value that we took from that. And certainly our customers appreciate touching the hand of the farmer that produces the soybeans that they use, and appreciating that their need to produce food for their people as a connection back to a country like Canada that values that relationship.
Thank you very much. And maybe, I'm not sure if everyone could answer this, but certainly when you look at the disruptive actions on the international scenes by the PRCs, the geopolitical environment, and the reason of, certainly we're having conversation today, and we talked very briefly about the 2019 example. Maybe I could hear a little bit your thoughts on the Canada's economic relation with the main Indo-Pacific economies, and that means countries of ASEAN. And one of the strategy's priority sectors for developing Canada's ASEAN's relation in agriculture and agri-food. What do you think a free trade agreement between Canada and the ASEAN would benefit Canada's soybean industry? And maybe if others have a thought on this, I would certainly like to hear you. And why?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, but I know my colleagues would also like to contribute. So when we look at trade agreements, they establish relations between governments. They establish a real opportunity to make trade more stable. And we really want to see a useful agreement established between Canada and Indonesia and ASEAN.
I would just quickly say that we're very supportive of the Canada-ASEAN as well as the Canada-Indonesia Free Trade Agreement. We cannot take international trade for granted. For those of us that were at the WTO Ministerial Conference in the UAE this year, rules-based international trade is something that directly benefits every Canadian regardless of your sector, and it's not something we can take for granted. So the more multilaterals, bilaterals Canada signs, the more rules-based trade, the better the quality of living for all 40-odd million Canadians.
And I just add that these are quickly growing markets, and our competitors are there. Australia has an agreement with these countries.
Thank
you
you.
very
And I
much.
know the.
That's your time, Ms.
Mr.
Lalonde.
Chair.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Kusarchis.
Oh, well, all right. Yes, we'll give Mr. Kacharski a quick moment here. Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Okay, I was just going to say very quickly, it's very gratifying to hear that the soybean and canola growers are looking to expand and diversify markets in ASEAN. I applaud that. The one thing I would say why that's particularly important is that before 2019, I just had a quick look at the statistics, but before the ban on canola, China represented 40% of Canada's total canola exports, and today, with $5 billion in exports, as was mentioned, Canada relies on the Chinese market for 65% of its total exports of canola. So, as good as that business is, I just want to point out that's a huge vulnerability in a world where tensions with China are likely to continue, and there are very likely to be disagreements again between Canada and China at some point. You can bet that that number of canola exports will be used as a coercive mechanism by China again. It's a vulnerability we do have.
All right. Thank you for that. Now we'll go to Monsieur Perron for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I'd like to continue along the same lines. Perhaps Mr. Curry first, if I may. Political insecurity in the region. We know what's happening in the East China Sea between China and the Philippines. A number of spats there. We saw what occurred only last week with Taiwan. What do you think about all of that? I know you have your office and you participate in negotiations, and that you'll be rolling things out in alternative markets, but there are tensions there, not just open tensions, but covert tensions, such as we saw with India over the past year, which certainly didn't help trade. I'd like your input on that. Well, when it comes to selling goods, there are always risks to manage. There's business opportunities, there's growth opportunities, and we're going after those growth opportunities. But one always has to analyze the risk profile, including political risks and infrastructure risks, troubles at ports, labour relations issues, the possibility of strikes, climate-related risks, and we analyse those risks when we go into markets. There are different ways of managing risks, and one of the main ways of doing so is to diversify to the greatest extent possible. It's not the only way to go about it. When it comes to managing long-term relationships, as my counterpart said on a number of occasions, there's regulations in Canada and in other countries that have a bearing on managing the long-term relationships between trading nations. So this is part and parcel of the risks that we manage. Now, what about Canada's presence in India currently? Is that an expanding market at this stage of the game? Well, perhaps I'm not as abreast of that situation as my colleagues would be. Please proceed.
India is a very big soy market, but one that we are shut out of because they have really high tariffs against our products.
That would be the same. It gets very political in India, and they do grow their own version of canola called rapeseed, but tariffs are very high. Just wanted to say that, we do work to establish relations with China. The chair of our farmer board, Roger Chevreau, was in Beijing in November. And just to Mr. Kacharski's point, we're less than actually 33% trade to China. If you're only looking at seed exports, then that is correct, but we're less than 33% trade exports to China. So we are working to diversify. They were $5 billion to $15.8 billion last year. Just wanted to get that on the record that our trade exposure to China is not actually increased.
Thank you, Mr. Perron. Actually, back when I was doing radio and television in Brandon, we called it rapeseed. I was the backup farm reporter, by the way, just so you know. All right, we'll go to Ms. McPherson for 2.5 minutes.
Pre-genetic version of rapeseed. Exactly. It's now called canola post-genetic modification.
Okay.
There are many people in the room that know much more about rapeseed and canola than I do. I can assure you. But thank you again for all of your information that you've been providing to us. Mr. Kerry, you talked about China, and one of the things that keeps coming into my mind is, it's risky to be working in this market. I recognize that it's a giant market, and I recognize how important it is to us, but it is a risk because they have proven that they don't recognize the rule-based order when it comes to international trade, and that they are willing to politicize and weaponize that at any time. It's just something that I'm trying to get my head around when we talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy. I've been very concerned with the strategy that we're in fact taking eggs from one basket and putting them in another with regards to human rights. We speak about India and the challenges that we have there, that we're not in fact thinking that this strategically enough, I guess, is one of my concerns. Now, I know in February, the government did open the Indo-Pacific Agriculture and Agri-Food Office. And I'm just wondering if all of you have some comments to make on whether you've seen any impact of that to date, and whether or not you believe that there is sufficient, that is resourced sufficiently, it has what it needs to do the job that it needs to do. Why don't we go backwards? Mr. Irons, why don't I start with you?
Happy to start. And when we were in Thailand, actually, we had the new director of the office present to our seminar and meet our customers and meet our exporters and farmers firsthand. So we're seeing that office, just recently set up this spring, is already having an impact by connecting regulators to regulators in different markets, such as Indonesia, such as Bangladesh, such as Thailand as well. And what we're seeing in that office is a real presence in the region. Just like I described that our sector is looking to be present in that region multiple times per year, so too is it helpful for the Government of Canada to be there more often in as many places as one can be. So the investment in the office shows that Canada's invested in the region, and what we've seen through our seminar this spring is having someone on the ground to speak to people, to make networks and expand networks, and having the Government of Canada present beyond what it has done in the past is really helpful.
I would say, echo my colleagues' comments. I guess it's not a criticism, our only advice would be we need a 5-year commitment. 5 years, we need to be looking longer term than simply 5 years. Right now it's a staff of about 10 with a $35 million envelope over a 5-year period. If we want to be serious about it, we need to look at that as that's just the beginning. This office can't go away after 5 years. And just lastly, that even in that part of the world, diplomatic postings are typically 3 years. As I spoke earlier about the deep relationship in that part of the world to do business, we should also consider potentially having longer diplomatic postings to establish those regulator to regulator relationships.
And I'd just add, in any market, you've got questions of political risk, of regulatory risk. The office, I think, is going to play a key role in managing regulatory risk, in particular, with the regulatory authorities in those countries. But it's also useful in terms of political risk because it helps show a commitment to our relations with those countries in the agri-food sector.
Thank you very much.
Now, any comments?
Well, I think those are all good, the risk management measures that were pointed out. The only thing I would say is that, irrespective of the good relationships and relationship building we try to do and having offices in the region and so on, a country that essentially, it's an authoritarian regime where political goals are going to trump trade and relationships, depending on the issue. So, it's good to have relationships, and I totally agree that it's a relationship-driven region. But at the end of the day, China will make decisions that are in its own political interest. And if that means we're a casualty, well, then so be it.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll now go to our next round. We have Mr. Chong and then Mr. Fragascatos. We did get a little bit of a late start, so we'll maybe do another round after that, Ms. Lantzman and Mr. Erskine-Smith, and then round it out with Mr. Perron and Ms. McPherson. So that'll polish off our first panel, if that's okay with you guys. So let's go. Mr. Chong for 5 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. When I first arrived here in 2004, a lot of free trade agricultural associations were telling us that we needed to diversify trade away from the United States because we were overly reliant on that single trading partner. And so subsequently, governments negotiated the Common Economic Trade Agreement with the European Union and the CPTPP in the Indo-Pacific region. When you look at global GDP, we've got a free trade agreement with the United States, which is about a quarter of global GDP. We've got one with Europe, which is just under 20%, and now we have one with the Indo-Pacific region, which is roughly another 15 or so percent. So we add it all up, we have free trade agreements now with over 50% of the global economy. And yet, it doesn't seem like we're taking advantage of those newly negotiated and implemented agreements. I pulled up some trade data. In 2022, the most recent year for which I have data, Canada's primary and secondary agricultural production amounted to $94 billion Canadian. Some of that going to the Indo-Pacific region. The Netherlands exported 167 billion Canadian dollars on current exchange rates. That's almost double what we exported. So why are grains and oilseeds associations not? What's the solution to this? Right? What's the solution? Because the Dutch export more fats and oils than we do, and as you know, they're on a postage stamp of a country. How come they export way more fats and oils than we do?
If I could start, thank you for the question. I guess I would first share that we are taking advantage of opportunities created by trade agreements. I was just in Korea as part of the Team Canada trade mission, and we have 17,000 tons out of a 300,000 ton market that we fill routinely every year. That is tariff-free, that is opportunity for us to add value and have the highest value soybeans go to those customers who appreciate our quality. And we would love to have more of that 300,000 ton market than the 17 that we have now through the trade agreement. So I would say that there are opportunities and we are taking advantage of them. But to your question, how do we get more? I think that's a really important question that our industry is continually speaking to our government partners about federally and provincially. And for us, it's about recognizing our competitive and comparative advantage and looking at the infrastructure required to help us excel. So there was a question earlier about transportation infrastructure. That is a key piece of it. Innovation infrastructure and research infrastructure that allows the industry to capture the most value from the highest value markets, to your point around how the Netherlands succeeds. We see those as key opportunities. So for us, for example, we're working on the next generation of a soy quality program. How do we sell the highest quality soy in the world without having a soy quality program here in Canada is a key question we're struggling with that we need to work together in our country on.
I would just say it's a very good question. And besides what my colleague said, we need massive investments in our trade corridors, our infrastructure, our ports, the demurrage costs. But
so as a colleague of mine mentioned, the Port of Vancouver ranked 347th out of 348 ports for global efficiency, second last out of 348. So what do we need to do to get the Port of Vancouver more efficient so that we can export more of your members' products to the Indo-Pacific region? Because that is our country's largest port.
Yeah, if you look at it from Brazilian's perspective, I said earlier, we have one bridge and we have one tunnel that goes in the Port of Vancouver. That's all owned by CN. So we have no resilience. There's no backup plan for that. Marine vessel traffic still takes precedence over getting rails action in the Port of Vancouver. We need railways to deliver on time. They need to be predictable. But to your broader point around why the Netherlands are so successful is, I would suggest that not only signing a free trade agreement is just the start. Implementing and following through on trade agreements are critical. The USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, have an entire office dedicated to the enforcement of their free trade agreements. We have not seen the CETA agreement provide really the opportunities for agriculture because the EU is not following through on the spirit of that. So I think a big part of it is looking at signing a trade agreement is relatively easy. It's very difficult, relatively easy. Implementing and enforcing the spirit of free trade agreements is something Canada needs to make a priority.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. We'll now go to Mr. Franciscatos for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Carey, earlier tonight you talked about the transactional nature of trade relationships that we find generally in Western countries, as opposed to Asia writ large, where something else is at play, where the importance of long-term relationships, I think you put it in that way, that's much more important in terms of serving as a driving force to ensure the long-term viability of trade relations. I wonder if you could expand a bit on that and what ultimately underpins those long-term relationships, how they're brought into being and how they're maintained.
Yeah, government and industry both have a role to play. The example that I use, my colleague Brian or Michael might have some great examples too, is that for the last, I think we're going on year 48, we call the pre-consultations, where we host the Japanese every year, then they host us every year. They want the same farmers going every year. They want to see the same government officials. We all recognize politics and democracies, but they want to know that when they have a relationship with Canada, whether it's importer, they know the people in Canada. They've come to Canada. They want to come visit our farms. They want to visit the facilities. Markets like that, like the Japanese market, I believe with soy as well, when that's established, that's a relationship going on 50 years of economic activity, nearly $1 billion of exports to Japan last year. But that has been the result of 40 plus years of industry government collaboration and dialogue. Oftentimes when you're doing business in parts of the world like Southeast Asia, the first meeting is not when you're closing the deal, where in the United States and Western Europe, that often is. It's transactional and you move on. They're looking to forge long-term relationships. They're looking in decades, not looking in, the next quarter, for example, and that requires sustained effort. Trade agreements, that requires trade missions, that requires offices, that requires hosting and reciprocating, and they really want us to come to Canada and see the farms that grow the products that they're purchasing. So there's no silver bullet, but it's sustained, long-term, genuine relationship building in that part of the world.
Point taken, and I think it's a point that might be lost on many, because you think trade, you think dollars and cents, the transactional sort of traditional approach, but it's not so straightforward. Any thoughts from Mr. Innes or Mr. Harvey on that point?
Just to build on my colleague's comments, when our sector looks at investment, the soybeans that are used in tofu today in Japan started more than 10 years ago here in Canada. It takes a long time to develop a specific variety of soybeans that will provide value to our customers. And it's not just providing value to our customers, but value to our farmers. So when we look at value-added food-grade soybeans, for example, it's giving our farmers 30% more per acre relative to the conventional or commodity alternative. And that long-term relationship value with the customer who tells the industry 10 years ahead what they're going to need in 10 years, and the industry invests and then delivers on it, speaks to the importance of long-term thinking.
I'd just bring it back to what Mr. Carey was saying about our infrastructure. Reliability is a key element of the relationship, because the buyers need to know that the product's going to arrive. And if you can't meet a timeline, then that's going to hurt your credibility, right?
No, of course. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I was recently at the Ferguson family bean farm just outside of London in St. Thomas. And when you made your point about how long it takes to develop a bean crop there, Mr. Ennis, matches with what exactly they told me. Now, I grew up in a rural area as well, so I don't come to it absent any knowledge, but always good to learn about these things. So what you're telling us basically is this requires a lot of hard work that, again, isn't noticed at first glance. What needs to go into all of this? Is it, well, actually, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mr. Carey. What do we need to prepare for as part of a wider Indo-Pacific strategy on the agriculture side to ensure these long-term relationships come into being and are sustained?
Yeah, I mean, as my colleague Mr. Innes said, knowing your markets, knowing what they want and why they're coming to Canada. Canada, we don't often have a price advantage. We have a high quality. We certainly have a reputation of food safety, of excellence in food products, but Canada is not the cheapest country to produce agriculture. We have a high standard of living. We've got high costs. So knowing what your markets want, and then as my colleague Mr. Harvey said, increasingly the questions that our colleagues around the CAFTA table get asked is by importers is, you've got the product, you've got the quality, will it be here on time? And that comes down to infrastructure, whether it's rail, ports, vessels. But knowing what your markets want and then delivering, but not delivering on time, is becoming an increasing problem for Canada's global reputation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Franciscatos. So we'll switch up a little bit. We'll go to Mr. Courig now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and it's been a great series of rounds. Now specifically, Mr. Carey, I know we've talked a little bit about the non-tariff trade barriers that had been put forward on Chinese imports of our canola products. I'm just curious if you can give me just very quickly a snapshot of where things are at in terms of addressing those things.
Yeah, the concerns that the Chinese officials cited were around weed seeds and other pathogens like blackleg, and those are issues that were adjudicated at a technical level. Canada did bring forth a WTO case, but as of right now, we have full market access restored with China, and again, not something we take for granted. We don't take any market for granted, but as of right now, all shippers have access to the Chinese market. However, they have to go through the requisite approvals, and canola seed is typically what they want. They like to crush it themselves.
Yeah. So I appreciate that.